Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. From this journal, I wanna start from literature review. The objective of learners learning Bahasa Indonesia mostly for practical purposes, not for searching academic degree, like for greeting, shopping at stores, in the market, bank, talking at immigration office, talking about politeness when chatting with Indonesian people. In chatting non-formal conversation, Indonesian people use dialects such as Indonesian Jakartaese dialect, Indonesian Javanese dialect, and Indonesian Sundanese dialect. These three Indonesian dialects are the most common ones. Riff commented that those dialects are widely used in everyday spoken Bahasa Indonesia. The three dialects, according to Riff, should be taught to the foreign learners of Bahasa Indonesia, or BIPA learners. Riff commented that those Indonesian dialects never been taught to foreign learners of Indonesian language because it is considered deviation and devastation. It is not nice to learn by foreign learners. But in fact, Riff argues that those dialects are so common use by Indonesian people when talking in non-formal context. Riff urges those dialects should be observed, described, and analyzed. He added that learning those dialects would create intimacy and closeness with Indonesian people. If those dialects are not learned, according to Riff, means one aspect of Indonesian language would be disappeared. To search for living Indonesian language, learners should find a place where Indonesian people talk naturally among them. Learners should be wary of this fact. To be successful language learners, they should not insulate from the Indonesian native speakers. They should cultivate their curiosity of the Indonesian culture, because learning a target language cannot be separated from its cultural insight. According to Sujarwo, non-formal Bahasa Indonesia is interfered by Indonesian dialects. Indonesian language actually does not have uniformity and unity of non-formal language. The lexical, information, grammatical, manners, and the like are from local languages. It is seen from the use of particles like si, dong, de, lo, anu, ko, to, la, ma, te, atu, and etc. These particles originally come from local languages. Acquisition resources. 1. People. In undergoing language acquisition process, a learner needs some basic resources. There are two major kinds of resources, namely people and the things that people produce. When learning first language, a learner needs people who know the first language. When learning the second language, nothing is more important than the people who know the second language. The idea of using insider, the potential Indonesian native speakers, are the main resources. When insiders meet other insiders, native Indonesian with other native Indonesians, they use language to assign each other to positions based on group membership, sex, male or female, age, older or younger, status, higher or lower, and familiarity, stranger, acquaintance, associate, friend, and relative. Language varies are important. Language varies are important ways with these factors. Language is a mirror of the inner organization of their group. There are two kinds of insiders, means Indonesian native speakers, namely generic and specific. All insiders know Bahasa Indonesia that foreign learners are trying to learn. They know what to say in a situation and how to say it. However, they may not know how to describe or explain their language or Bahasa Indonesia in terms that are helpful to the learner, at least at the first. A major task in acquisition process is identifying and utilizing generic knowers who can help learners to learn Indonesian language. As an outsiders or learners, he or she needs to learn how to pick Indonesian native speakers who are ready, willing, and able out of the crowd, so to speak, and establish a solid relationship with Indonesian native speakers. Acquisition resources 2. Things. Foreign language learners of Bahasa Indonesia needs some helpful things. Learners can get a lot of help from things or authentic resources like TV programs, cinetrons, films, and the radio programs. From the very first, learners can use these electronic things for passive learning, for passive listening and watching. Learners will increase gradually as they make a habit of this. Learners hear Indonesian language used and watch TV programs that happen. Other authentic resources are newspapers, magazines, and books related to cultural insights, and books related to cultural insight. But this is alone, it's not enough. Learners should discuss their authentic resources with the potential Indonesian native speakers. A learning approach. So far, there are two crucial debates for mastering a second language, namely by learning and by acquisition. By learning means students directed and controlled by teacher in the classroom in a formal atmosphere. A teacher explains about language. A teacher does not encourage his students to use the target language they learn. While by acquisition, students should have initiative to use the target language they learn. Students should have get out and involved with Indonesian native speakers in natural atmosphere. The acquisition is a dreadful task for most American students. They are afraid of meeting Indonesian people. Instead, they use their Bahasa Indonesia with their house helpers. While at school, the teachers explain a lot about Bahasa Indonesia. Our teacher does not encourage their students to use Bahasa Indonesia. Most teachers of BIPA teach formal Bahasa Indonesia. The reasons are: 1. Bahasa Indonesia non-formal is hard to explain. 2. Bahasa Indonesia non-formal is not nice to learn by foreign students or BIPA students. The result is students use Bahasa Indonesia soundly like bahasa pembantu, bahasa house helpers talk. Besides that, students insulate themselves from the thousands of Indonesian people who provide significant and opportunity for practicing Bahasa Indonesia. Schools have divorced students from everyday life. Schools has implied that language cannot be learned properly without teacher, classroom, books, and electronic gadgets. Schools have intimidated students to the point where they believe they must speak exactly like the teacher or not at all. The good students read recommended books, thus a science designed by the teachers, and take tests which the teacher alone develops. Teacher in the classroom does not realize that through the world people learn language without formal lessons. They do so simply on the strength of their motivation, their common sense, their willingness, experiment, imitate, and to be corrected when they make mistakes. Teachers at school prepare the students to obey and demand what a teacher wants, and students should prepare to do what a teacher demanded, and students should obey them. Most Americans believe with the assumptions that if you want to learn a second language, you should go to school. School is considered to be a good place to learn a second language. School has implied that second language cannot be learned without the presence of a teacher in the classroom. Instruments. In writing this paper, the writer relies on his experiences when he was employed at IMLAC, Indonesian Multi-Language Acquisition Center in Bandung, Indonesia. The writer used to work at IMLAC for 16 years. Besides that, the writer also uses his documents like diaries, books, and journals related to this topic. Findings and discussions. In order to reach the de-alienation process, a learner needs to develop a strategy. He or she needs to identify aspects of his or her own behavior that the native Indonesian appreciate and then cultivate them. A learner also needs to identify aspects of his or her own behavior that repulsive to the native Indonesian people. In undergoing de-alienation process, a learner needs to decrease his or her insulation and increase his or her involvement with the native Indonesian people. According to Larson, native speakers of the target language and what they produce are the main and the basic resources for language learning and acquisition. Learners should be aware that most native Indonesians are not willing foreigners learn non-formal Bahasa Indonesia. A major task in Indonesian acquisition is identifying and utilizing generic and specific knowers or Indonesian people who can help learners learn Indonesian language. Pick the native Indonesian who are ready, willing to establish a solid relationship with learners. Having high motivation is not enough. Language acquisition is highly dependent on some other factors such as aptitude, attitude, age, opportunity to get involved with Indonesian natives. The other problem is some learners would undergo what so-called culture shock and culture stress while they are living in Indonesia. This is due to difference of culture behavior and cultural systems in Indonesia. Becoming bilingual is part of de-alienation process, means becoming less foreign in a culture in which one is an alien. Adult learners are hard to acquire a target language or Indonesian language if learners do not involve and love Indonesian native speakers and its culture. The heart of the daily learning a target language is using it or communicating it with people in the community or in the speech community of the target language. A foreign learner should use his target language as a means of communicating and interacting with people or with Indonesian native speakers. A learner needs the help of the native speakers of Bahasa Indonesia who understand some English. He needs what so-called informants. The language informants of Bahasa Indonesia should be honest and should be willing and persistently for correction and errors done by the learners, either for language corrections or cultural mistakes. The informants should be more eager to help the learner than to improve his own mastery of English. Informants should probably not be a teacher. Why? Well, because teachers tend to have their own ideas about teaching techniques, and most teachers will teach about the language rather than help learners practice the language. Learners may not use terms teach or teacher. Better use the term informant. A successful language learner begins with how much he takes advantage of the potential abundance of the Indonesian native speakers. He has to use a method called field method, namely listen, understand, and speak the target language he learns. Many American learners who suffered from monolingual myopia are hard to get involvement with Indonesian people. They have difficulties in mastering Bahasa Indonesia without the presence of a teacher who teaches them Bahasa Indonesia through learning and explaining them about Bahasa Indonesia. They don't realize that throughout the world people learn other languages without formal lessons. They do simply on the strength of their motivation, their common sense, their willingness to experiment, to imitate, and to be corrected when making mistakes. They pay moderate attention to the spoken language and its use in everyday conversation. What will learners do with native Indonesians? Well, at least learners should talk about cultural behavior, cultural systems, and interesting topics. In learning system, mostly teachers demand and prepare their student to obey what the teacher wants. Teachers would make their student what they want and depend on what so-called learning system. Teachers keep away the students from the realities of the real world around about the learners. Many American learners operate with the tacit assumption that if you want to learn a second language, you should go to school you should give the control and submit to the control of a teacher. So, successful language learners should learn a little and use it a lot. They should get what they need and then use their target language in actual communication with the target language or native speakers of Indonesian. Learners should spend time using their authentic materials, discussing them with their potential Indonesian native speakers and their Indonesian informants. Conclusion and suggestion. Learners of BIPA in Indonesia have a lot of advantages compared to the learners of BIPA abroad. They are surrounded by an abundance of potential Indonesian native speakers, both generic and specific Indonesian native speakers. They are willing and nice to talk to. Learners are recommended to have more Indonesian informants. By having more Indonesians, student would obtain much information about what hard issues happen in Indonesia. Indonesian natives are highly needed in language acquisition. Learners should submit themselves to the potential Indonesian native speakers and live out their attributes while learning Bahasa Indonesia and its culture. Learners who learn Bahasa Indonesia through learning system would good though, but their mastering Bahasa Indonesia would be slow. Teachers tend to explain about language instead of asking their student to speak in their language they learn. Many American learners suffered from monolingual myopia or English. It is understandable because many people they meet take advantage of them to speak English. Most teachers tend to teach Bahasa Indonesia baik dan benar, or good and right Bahasa Indonesia. They are not willing to teach learners the real living in Bahasa Indonesia used by Indonesian people in everyday conversation. Thank you. That's